Okay, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today we're exploring how two entirely different frameworks look at the exact same physical and genetic evidence to explain human history. On one side we have the standard model, which relies on millions of years of gradual change. And on the other side we have the unified theory of geologic history, or UTGH for short, which is a rapid, catastrophist framework. Now, we aren't here to take sides today. We're just here to impartially unpack the arguments, map out the human dispersion, and see exactly how both models interpret the very same bones and DNA.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the core question driving both of these frameworks. How do we explain the massive variety in human skin color, hair texture, physical size, and overall dimensions? I mean, look around the globe. We are a wildly diverse species. Both models look at this exact same diversity, but they propose radically different mechanisms and timelines for how it all came to be.
It basically boils down to two completely different clocks applied to the same evidence. The standard model says modern human diversity requires at least 50 to 100,000 years of geographic separation and really slow genetic drift. The UTGH model, however, argues this diversity happened incredibly fast. We're talking roughly 200 generations, or just 5,000 to 6,000 years, following a massive global catastrophe.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll briefly look at the post-flood bottleneck, explore the mechanics of rapid adaptation, reinterpret the so-called cavemen, examine the bizarre island effect, and finally, compare the math behind both of these diversity models.
All right, let's get into Section 1, the post-flood bottleneck. We're looking at survival and dispersion.
To build a picture of human survival following a literal global reset, the UTGH framework proposes a very specific chronology. It maps it out chronologically, starting with a pre-flood world, followed by a catastrophic rupture event roughly 5,300 years ago. Then, about 531 years after this flood, the model identifies the Peleg division. This is a period where rising sea levels supposedly sank connecting land bridges, ultimately locking migrating populations into completely isolated regions.
Under this UTGH framework, human dispersion maps outward in concentric circles, starting from this catastrophic reset. In the center, you have Noah's family of 8 on the ark, yielding 3 broad divisions of humanity working outward through Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But here is where the model introduces a major twist. It argues that not everyone descended through Noah's family. It actually proposes that disparate groups, specifically Cain's lineage, were flood survivors outside the ark. They supposedly made it by sheltering in the rocky Caucasus-Zagros-Altai corridor, way up high above the floodline.
Moving right along to Section 2, dispersal and rapid adaptation, let's talk about epigenetic changes.
So, you might be wondering, if these disparate survivor groups only had a few thousand years, how on earth did they develop such entirely different skin colors, hair textures, bone densities, and physical sizes? Well, the UTGH proposes a mechanism called epigenetic expression. It argues that these founding populations carried a front-loaded genome, meaning the genetic potential for literally every variation, from dark skin for high UV exposure to light skin for low sunlight to different hair textures, was already packed inside their DNA. Extreme environmental pressure simply activated these hidden traits over just a few generations.
When you place these ideas side by side, the contrast is absolutely stark. The standard model requires tens of thousands of years for random genetic mutations to just slowly build up those physical adaptations. But the UTGH model argues this diversity wasn't built from scratch. It was simply activated. It suggests that a fully loaded genetic code, when pushed to the absolute extremes by a harsh post-flood environment, could express the entire spectrum of human diversity in a fraction of the time.
Okay, Section 3, reinterpreting the cavemen. Let's look at archaic human DNA.
So where do the famous cavemen fit into this picture? Well, according to the UTGH model, they all descended from Adam and Eve too. Under this alternative framework, Neanderthals and Denisovens weren't separate evolutionary species walking parallel to us. Instead, they were simply those isolated, disparate branches of the human family we just talked about, heavily adapted to extreme highland conditions. Neanderthals in the West developed heavy brow ridges to warm cold air, while Denisovens adapted to the harsh conditions in the East. It's the exact same human family, just showcasing extreme epigenetic adaptations.
And here is where it gets really fascinating.
As Noah's descendants mapped their way outward in those concentric circles after the flood, they eventually walked right into these highland corridors. Mainstream science sees archaic DNA in modern humans as clear evidence of interbreeding with ancient ape-men. But the UTGH framework looks at that exact same genomic data and calls it a family reunion. The dispersing arc descendants simply encountered their highly adapted, rugged cousins, and they reintegrated.
Next up is Section 4, the island effect. We're going to talk about Homo Luzuonensis.
This brings us to a wildly fascinating anomaly, the tiny, isolated humans found on islands, specifically the remains discovered in Callao Cave in the Philippines. Mainstream science categorizes Homo luzuonensis as a completely separate evolutionary species dating back 67,000 years, but the UTGH framework argues they are simply human ancestors of the modern Negrito people living on that island today, and they are exhibiting a known biological rule called insular dwarfism.
According to the UTGH model, it was literally the island that made them small. Just as the Channel Islands shrank a mammoth and the island of Flores shrank an elephant, Luzon shrank a human. The model uses this to argue that the human genome is incredibly adaptable over a very short amount of time when populations are isolated by rising sea levels.
Which brings us to our final stop, Section 5, Two Models of Human Diversity. Let's look at the math of history.
We've mapped out the dispersion, the rapid physical adaptations, and the cavemen. Now let's look at the sheer mathematical difference between these frameworks. To get to today's modern diversity, the standard model requires roughly 2,333 generations since humans supposedly left Africa. The UTGH framework, on the other hand, claims it all happened in roughly 204 generations since that rupture event. That is a staggering difference.
And this leads to a massive challenge when we look at the archaeological record. The alternative model asks a pretty tough question. If modern humans have been around for over 2,000 generations, why do complex worldwide civilizations only pop up in the historical record roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago? The standard model says earlier traces were simply lost or submerged over deep time. The UTGH model says, no, those earlier traces were violently erased by a global catastrophe, and what we call the dawn of civilization is actually just post-flood reconstruction.
Ultimately, we are looking at two entirely different lenses applied to the exact same physical world. When you are faced with the exact same bones, the exact same ruins, and the exact same DNA, which clock makes the most sense to you? Are you willing to look at the evidence without deciding what it's allowed to say in advance? Whether you favor the deep time of the standard model or the rapid adaptation of the UTGH framework, the real goal is always to keep asking why and to keep thinking for yourself.